So, good ministers always have 3 points in a poem, right? Always have 3 points, poem, a song, collection, So I'm going to leave all that stuff off. But I am going to give you 3 points that I'm going to kind of anchor around. And so by the time we're done today, I'm going to kind of hit on 3 themes. One of the themes that will kind of weave through my story, I'm going to call it the stories that we tell, okay? We're going to think about that concept of the stories that we tell, especially the stories we tell ourselves. Then I'm going to talk a little bit by the end about expectations or acceptance, okay? And then finally, I'm going to wrap it all up and I'm going to talk about the search for authentic community. And that's why we're here today, right? We're here because on any given Sunday morning, there's a lot of people that get up and go to church and they have a community to show up to and a community to be with. But this morning, I got to go be with my people. And that means something to me. So you're going to hear more about that. So let's dive right in. So there's been so many versions of this story over the years. And I really think that life reshapes you. Life and the things you go through reshape you. And it does reshape the way you look at your own story. When you're younger and you're full of, piss and vinegar and you've got all this energy, your story may be about how you're conquering the world. As you get older and you have children or life happens, it may be the story's more about just life, what happens in life, right? So this story's had many versions over time, and say that I've told my story many times, it's a phrase you may have heard before. I've given my testimony. I've given my testimony many times. And so you're going to hear a bit of that. My journey into adulthood really began with a bang when I turned 18, okay? Now, that's where the story's going to take off, but every comic book hero has a little bit of a backstory. So I didn't arrive at this world at 18, with like all ready to go. As a child, I really grew up in a home where my parents were Lutherans, and my brother was 15 years older than me, and my sister was, my brother, was 17 years older than me, and my sister was 15 years older than me. So apparently my parents were really into the Lutheran church about the time that my brother and sister needed to go through confirmation class. And I think that's 12 or 13 or something like that. But they were out of it. By the time I was raised up, we were CE only Christians. You know what CEO is? Christian Easter only, okay? By that time, we were going to church on Christmas Eve, which was kind of cool. This candlelight service at midnight in Lutheran church was kind of cool. Christmas is coming, right? And then Easter, that's all I really knew about until late, okay? And that's how I grew up. And as a teenager, I'm just going to admit, my identification, we would call it heads. It wasn't sexual, it stood for potheads, okay? We were potheads. And in my day, we were called heads. We were the heads. There were jocks, and a few other kinds of whatever labels people put on people. But I was definitely a pothead. About 1982, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, I lived that life, okay? That was me. I would have hung out with those dudes and fit in with Fast Times at Ridgemont High, and my dad did have an awesome set of tools, so I could have fixed anything as a kid. If you recognize that reference, we're all too old. So here I arrive at 18. It's 1986. So do the math, I'm 54. 1986, I have no prospects. I have no skills. I quit high school, which was a really dumb shit thing to do, okay? We could go on forever on how dumb shit that was. But I quit high school, and here I was with no prospects, except I was really good at boosting car stereos. And so I could jump in and out of a car, and I have a car stereo out in no time at all. I lived next to a giant General Motors plant where they assembled all the Camaros, IROCs, Z28s, everything that was sold that side of the Mississippi was made in that plant in Cincinnati, Ohio, Norwood, Ohio. And I was boosting car stereos straight out of the factory. Cars would get produced, and I was stealing new car stereos, 5 and 6 at a time, because they put them in trains, and I would get into the train car and steal the stereos out and clean them out. And I was doing that over and over and over again, repeatedly, until one day I wasn't. So I got arrested in early 1987. And I ended up in jail at 18. And I was in the county jail in Cincinnati, Ohio. Now, I'll spare you the details, but I want you to imagine right now, I know I'm a frumpy looking old white dude, right? But imagine me at 18. I was actually kind of cute at 18, right? I had these dimples, I was really skinny, and I was fresh meat. And a young man going into a jail system at 18 is going to run into a lot of problems. So I did everything I could to keep my head down. Old timers told me one thing that maybe somebody in this room have heard this before. Never take nothing for free. If you're ever in jail, I hope you're never, but never take anything from anybody, because nobody will ever give you anything for free. If you don't have something to give them in return, they're going to figure out a way for you to pay them back, and you might not like. what they're going to do. So I got an early introduction to how horrifying jail could be for an 18-year-old. I will say over all the years I managed to escape without any serious damage. There's a lot of bad things that happened, and I did get through it without the worst of the worst happening. But I'll spare you the legal details. I was convicted of a felony in March of 1987. So I had turned 18 in September. 4 months later, I was arrested, and a couple months after that, I was convicted of a felony, and I was sentenced to a 1.5 years in prison. The eventual charge was receiving stolen property, so the maximum sentence after the plea was a 1.5 years. So I was sent off to the only place in Ohio that prisoners go. In Ohio, they have an interesting system. They want you to serve your time at a jail near home so that your parents, your wife, your kids could come and visit you on Sundays or whenever. But they all send you to one central place to be processed. And at the time, in 1987, that was the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio is a giant, iconic building. Have anybody seen the movie The Shawshank Redemption? You've seen the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio. It is that building. And so I was there for 48 days in 1987. It was built in the late 1800s, like 1897. And by 1992, federal courts had ordered the state of Ohio to stop housing prisoners in that building. That it was cruel and unusual punishment to house human beings in that building. The state of Ohio immediately started building a new prison to house everybody, right? But this is 1987. That prison hadn't been built yet. So we're still in the shithole of shitholes. So after 48 days in Shawshank, I was then shipped out. And I'll probably tell stories later about kind of what that experience is. And I will do one rabbit trail. Years later, I was driving by, and I knew the building was closed. And so I snuck up to the building, and there was no one around, and I broke into it. I actually am probably the only person you've ever met that had broke into a prison. So I broke into the Ohio State Reformatory and found paintings on the walls of Lenin and Stalin that was used in Air Force One. I found things that were used in the movie Turner and Hooch. And then I found weird walls and pieces of paper that talked about Castle Rock. And then that is where I found the tie into Castle Rock in the movie The Shawshank Redemption. Later, I was able to actually take part in a documentary on the movie. So if you have or have seen the 10th anniversary edition of The Shawshank Redemption, there is a special feature called Shawshank, the Redeeming Feature, and myself and a couple of other ex-prisoners from Shawshank are in that documentary. So I may tell you more about that later. So here's kind of the order of events. I was in prison as a young man, had my heads down, I can tell you all kinds of terrible stories, but we'll skip those. And I arrived at the Dayton Correctional Institute. After 48 days, I get sent to the Dayton Correctional Institute. After 5 months in the Dayton Correctional Institute, I received what they did in Ohio. It was called shock probation. Shock probation is basically, they don't parole you, so you're not paroled. You're on probation, and it really is probation. It's different than many states. You don't normally go to prison first, and then go to probation. You go to probation, then prison. Ohio's all jacked up. They even have a penitentiary system on top of the reformatory system that you could end up besides Mansfield, right? So it's a very funky old system. So I ended up on shock probation. And the next phase of my story, I want to call it release and abscondments. So I played a lot of games in those early days, right? I had made a dedication like everybody else does in jail. You know, there's always these jailhouse conversion stories. You get in jail, what's the first thing a guy might do? Cry, plead to God, oh God, get me out of here. And honestly, back in jail before I was released, especially at the time I spent in the Dayton Correctional Institute, I had a lot of time to think. And at that point, I did what many of you probably heard this term before, but I accepted Jesus into my heart. And if you've ever had anybody explain to you from the Bible what that means to accept Jesus into your heart, it's very prescriptive. There's a very definite thing it means, okay? I won't, of course, take time to tell you what it means, because I no longer believe it's true. But at that moment, when I accepted Jesus, I was 100% convinced it was real. I accepted it beyond question. And at that time, it was something that I needed. Shit, I'm sitting in prison. I mean, what could be more comforting than to think that maybe God loves me, and maybe this shithole of a person that I was with no prospects, maybe I could actually be something with my life if I just got it together, right? So it kind of motivated me. Well, I got out of jail on this shock probation, And I was in a halfway house, and you would think that I try to keep my shit together, but I had some stash before I went away to prison. You see, the day that I went to my final hearing, I thought I was going to get probation. I thought I was going home that day. I had a cigar in my pocket, a coupon for a $20 steak meal, at a steakhouse, a little bit of money in my pocket, and I had some weed back home that I was going to celebrate when I got up and done, right? I thought this was going to be a great day. I went and stood before the judge that day, and I thought I was going out through the front door. I went out through the back door. So when I got hauled off to prison, I didn't expect that they were actually going to send me to prison. I thought, nice little white boy like me, never been in trouble. He surely won't send me to prison. Well, yeah, he did. He did. So I get back home, I'm in the halfway house. They let me out for the weekend. I go back home, and that stash is still there. So I start playing the game, start trying to, skirt the line. Really not really living what you would think you'd be living as a Christian, right? And then I get arrested again. I wind up back in the county jail. Again, maybe some people in this room have heard another jail saying. Another jail saying, don't write your name on a jailhouse wall, or, anybody guess how that finishes? Or you'll be back to see it. Don't write a name on the jailhouse wall, you'll see it again. So here I was several months after, I was now 19, but here I am back in the same jail. And I look under the desk, and my freaking name was on the wall. I wrote my name. Son of a bitch, this is the same cell I was in. I wept. I wept, and I wept, and I wept. There's no way I'm going to make it, man. I can't make it out in 2 months without being back in jail. And I thought my life was over. I did. And then in the back of my mind, I thought, what does Jesus say? If you just really would have gotten into it, maybe you wouldn't be in jail right now. So I rededicated my life. And a weird thing happened. I had a probation officer who, in some incredible stroke of kindness, which she showed me many kindnesses over my time with her, but she decided that she didn't want to send me back. Because she knew when I talked about how scared I was to go back to Mansfield, because I would have went back there. I would have reprocessed through the field, right? Which is what we call it, the field. She knew that it was going to be really bad for me. I cried before the judge, begging the judge, please don't send me back. You know what it's like there, Judge. It's really bad. So she let me go to a boot camp. Now, normally you go to boot camp first, right? And if you mess up, then you go to prison. Well, I went to the boot camp. I was the only guy in the boot camp. The boot camp was next to the prison that I was in. I could look through the fence and see dudes that I used to know and yell, hey, shitheads, I'm over here. I thought it was great, but I had to go through it. So the boot camp was 6 months long and then back to a halfway house. By the time I finally got out of prison, I got out of prison one day before I would have gotten out. Had I not accepted the shock probation, had I just stayed in, I would have only been in prison one more day. I could have avoided all the trouble that I got in on the outside and all of that chaos, but it didn't happen. So here I am, I'm arriving back into my town. I'm allowed to go back home. I've gotten a job, my probation officer's happy. I'm working temp jobs and working my ass off and stuff like that. But I also had a friend recommend me to a church, a Baptist church. And I found there a new community that accepted me unconditionally. Now I'm going to qualify that. There is a condition. The condition was that I was a believer in Jesus, okay? But other than that, and the baggage with the Bible and everything else, it's a lot of baggage. But let me just say just the community, just the pure people aspect of it. They gave me something that I never had before. Number one, I had a community that I could fit into, and they didn't care how much pot I could smoke or how much beer I could drink or how fucked up I was. They just loved me. So right away, the pastor and the teachers in the church let me start teaching this whole testimony thing. Hey, you got a guy fresh out of Shawshank, which Shawshank wasn't even released by then. You got a guy fresh out of prison. Let's let this young kid. I was just so excited. Except you can't tell, right? I was so excited to tell my story that, man, I was telling my story everywhere. Nursing homes, classrooms, preaching from the pulpit. Even 3 months into this whole thing, I was speaking to groups 250, 300 people long. Did a New Year's Eve service, my first New Year's Eve there, like, packed! And I'm speaking, telling my story, right? And I was good at it. I loved it. So I wanted to go to Bible college. I wanted to hone these skills. I wanted to become a better speaker. And now, not too long-winded of a speaker. I'm just looking at the time. I wanted to become a better speaker. I wanted to serve God. I wanted to dedicate my life. And I wanted to go all the way, okay? So, there's different let's think about the military, and I don't want to stir up too much rivalries, but you kind of see like the Marines are the best of the best, right? Or maybe the Green Berets, or maybe these SEAL teams, right? Going to Baptist Bible college that I went to was like the SEAL team. It was like the Green Berets of the Baptists. We were independent, fundamental, Bible-believing, pre-millennial, evangelical Christians. I could throw labels out a mile long. All these labels mean is we were a very narrowly focused, very fundamental Baptist group. And beyond anything else, they believed the Bible, and that was everything the Bible says is true, and that's the starting point, okay? I'll talk more about that later. But they sponsored me to go to Bible college. So I've only been out of Bible college 6 months. Out of prison, 6 months. And I'm off to Bible college. So, as all of us do in college, I've had some life-changing relationships. I've heard lots of people say, it's not so much your high school friends, but your college friends that, you're doing life together, you're starting out, and you become like these lifelong friends. And that happened to me too. Even today, I've got probably a very small number of friends around the world that I went to college with that I would still consider very true friends that I met in college. And I worked my ass off. I learned how to work. I dropped out, you remember? So how does a dropout then go to college? Well, you got to get a GED, and then you go to college, and I hadn't studied in years, right? I had to literally get out of class at noon, eat lunch, and spend the whole rest of the day and the evening study, because I had not done this, and I wanted to get A's. I didn't want to just coast through. I wanted to do good. So the first year, I came in January, so that semester, came back for the first fall semester, and I just worked my ass off. But during this time, I had the number one new relationship start, and that was my meeting my wife, Tanya. So I had to put her in the picture that I sent because she's gorgeous, and I love her so much. And you're going to hear more about that relationship, and that's probably where I'm going to crack up a little bit, okay? I'm going to break up. We also had our son, Joseph. My first son was born when I was a senior in Bible college. So the last semester in college, I worked I worked at a motel. Midnight to 7 or 11 to 7 a.m. And then I went to school all morning. Then I came home and slept, and I got up and I did it all over again for a year. We had a baby that was born in October, and I didn't graduate till May. And then in March of that year, my mother died. My mother died 3 months before I got out of college. And she was probably my biggest supporter. So that began a really painful next chapter. I made it to Bible college. My mom knew I was going to make it. She knew. She got to see my son, she got to see my wife, and she knew I was okay, right? But my next chapter, my story is all centered on my dedication at this point. Everything that I thought about myself, who I was, it all centered around that dedication to Jesus, and it all centered around becoming a missionary. We didn't want to just be a pastor. We wanted to be missionaries, which was the elite of the elite. Like taking your kids to a foreign country and living in some third world place and don't care about, you don't have nice things, it doesn't matter. We're there for Jesus, right? We're going to do it. And so after graduation, this particular missionary organization requires an internship. Okay? And so I had to do at least 2 years of internship. So I'm going to talk about that internship. I went back to Cincinnati, Ohio, which is where I was from, back to the church that sponsored me into Bible college to begin with. And I want to give a little bit of a label for this part of the story, because I don't want to tell you the whole story about what happened there, but I want to give you a label that will help you understand what it was like there. I call it Good Pastor, Uprising of Deacons. So what do I mean by that? I think about this idea how life changes you and how it shifts your perspective, and it really applies here. The expectations that we have for life. This pastor had been a pastor for 37 years. And the deacons of the church met together and asked him to leave as pastor. And I was still there. Asked him to leave. And here's why. He told me, he said, Mark, be careful what you teach people from the Bible. Because if you teach them one way for many years and then you change to what you believe, you may never get them to change with you. And the particular issue that this pastor struggled with was the issue of being divorced and in the ministry. It seems like such a freaking ridiculous issue, right? But this was a real issue to them. Divorced people cannot be ministers, is what he taught for many years. Well, guess what happened? His son, who really wanted to be a minister, got a divorce. Then got remarried to a girl who also wanted to be, she was into it, man. They wanted to go be and serve God together. So they came back to the church that his father pastored, and he was an associate preacher. And those deacons had burned him up. And then guess what was the final straw? They let him preach. Oh my God, you let him preach the Bible? He's divorced. And the uprising began. So those men asked me, Mark, would you stay and be our interim pastor until we find another? I said, you gotta be kidding me. He's the man. I'm loyal to him. What you're doing here is wrong. This is stupid. And so the pastor of 37 years took a package to gracefully leave as a pastor emeritus without creating a big stink, and basically left pretty dejected, right? And then he helped me 2 things. I got ordained during that in May. And then he hooked me up with another pastor in Homestead, Florida. So I go to Homestead, Florida. I pack my wife up, my kids. By now, my wife is pregnant with our second son, Jonathan. And we moved to Homestead, Florida. Anybody know where Homestead is? It's south of Miami, okay? So think of Miami. Keep going like you're heading to the Keys. You'll go through Homestead, okay? And at the time, you might remember in the 90s, a gigantic hurricane wiped the town out. I lived there 2 years after that. So the town was still really wiped out. I mean, you drive through today, it's a different town, but it was still wiped out. A lot of raw emotions. And I'll describe this relationship as devious pastor, abused church. What do I mean by that? Well, I kind of found the opposite. I found a pastor who actually only brought me there for one reason. He brought me there to fire his associate minister. He told me this the first day I met with him. The real reason I brought you here is so I can fire Bruce. Because Bruce did this, Bruce did that, Bruce did this, Bruce did this. And I'm like, oh shit, what have I got myself into? I'm going to be working with Bruce. Bruce is terrible. Then I get to working with Bruce. Bruce grew up in that church. Bruce had given his life to it. Bruce went off to Bible college, came back to serve. Bruce was a wonderful human being that was just trying to do the best job that he could. And the pastor was a wackadoodle. He was whacked. So by the time the story was over, not only did Bruce leave, but his associate pastor who had been there like 32 years left. And he had nothing. These were Baptists that didn't even believe in Social Security, right? So the man had nothing. He got fired and died of a heart attack 3 months later after getting fired. At which point I wrote a letter to that pastor that was titled, How Can You Sleep at Night? And I sent him a letter that I actually sent to all the deacons and made a big stink of it. But eventually I couldn't believe that these people would tolerate that. And eventually they didn't. They kicked him out. That church is still pretty screwed up today. But so, young minister, 2 what they call bad church experiences. There's even a book out there, Bad Church Experiences, right? I have seen the worst of the worst. I have seen what it means for people to look at you as a paid professional holy person and look at how you dress or what car you drive and go, well, that's not as nice as mine, right? Or we must be paying you too much, right? And really, my first year in ministry, I was in poverty. My wife and I can show you my tax returns. We run to the poverty level for 3 years in a row while I was a professional minister with 2 babies, okay? So I decided not to be beholden ever again. I still wanted to be a minister. I still did. But I decided that I would never, ever be in a position where I had to worry about my income from a bunch of goofballs who should keep their mouths shut about what I'm doing. So was I bitter? Yeah, I was. Yeah. I never ever considered a professional paid position again. So we decided to move to Dallas for a couple of reasons. My friends told me there were jobs in Dallas. They said, move here. There's jobs in Dallas. I also had several people I went to Bible college with that had went to Dallas Theological Seminary. So my plan was to come and go to DTS. And if you ever heard DTS is on the other side of Dallas here, it is actually, and still is today, if you look at the circles of like higher education and theology, it's one of the best in the world. And it still is recognized today. So it's if you wanted to be the best of the best, it's a place to come. Get a degree from DTS, you're going to earn it. You're going to earn it. So about that same time, in 1998, I moved here in 95, a couple years into this whole gig, my father died. So when my father died, it turned a switch on my brother and I's relationship. I think we began to draw closer than we ever had. My sister and I are still, she's alive today. We're not close, and that's a whole other story, but my brother and I began to be very close. Even though they were 17 years apart, when I got 30, we caught up. One night over beers, he apologized to me. He said, Mark, I am so sorry when you were growing up. I never did anything with you. And I just looked at him and I said, brother, you had shit to do. And that became our motto. I had shit to do. It's okay. The fact that we weren't brothers until I was 30, he was more like an uncle, right? But we became brothers at about age 30 by going through this pain together. And so During that time, I began to drink again and drank. Had been completely sober for many, many, many years. Now, 8 years, through Bible college. I began to drink, I began to smoke, and I began to drift away. Drift away both mentally, spiritually, just emotionally, drift away from my family. My kids were young, we're raising kids, living in Arlington, Texas, going to work every day. And it's you're doing life, but I began to drift away and began to pull away and began to withdraw. About the same time we moved to Dallas, I fell, honestly, ass backwards into a career. So if you've been in Dallas very long, in August of 1995, if you could spell the word computer and wanted a tech support job, we could have gotten you a job. I'm not exaggerating. I helped hire people that our logic question